Well, hello again, everybody. Thank you. I'm really incredibly excited for this session. We don't have the title up on the screen yet. It's about where we stand in Wisconsin and in the Midwest is the title, but the panelists are going to sort of expand that to talk about Wisconsin and all of the swing states. And I was down in the green room with our panelists a little while ago, and I was impressed by the encyclopedic knowledge our panelists have today of political trends, historical trends, and of course, Wisconsin. So this is going to be a fabulous session of ours. As many of you know, Charles Franklin is the director of the Marquette University Law School Poll, and we all know that's the gold standard of measuring voter sentiment in Wisconsin. He's a long-term time friend of mine and of the Capital Times, and is a professor of law and public policy at Marquette University. This is the 8th year we've been doing these Idea Fests, and Charles has been here several times and always draws a big and attentive crowd, we've learned through the years. Clearly today is no exception. Charles is widely respected both in the state and obviously because of the swing state importance of Wisconsin is well known and sought after nationally. The latest Marquette poll came out recently and will certainly be a topic today. When Charles and I had coffee many weeks ago, maybe months ago, to talk about his appearance here, we struck on the idea of creating a conversation about the election outlook in mid-September and not only a presentation. He was thrilled with the idea of bringing the best of national political journalism, journalists to appear with him, and that's what we have today. Charles will be joined by Dan Balls and Karen Tumulty, both of the Washington Post, both longtime national stars in the world of political journalism, and both of whom have already appeared once at Idea Fest this week. Dan is the Post's chief correspondent, has been here many times, including last night when he moderated a fascinating discussion with author-journalist Sam Friedman, who's here today, and Dan Kaufman about the history and outlook of progressivism in Midwestern politics. Karen is a Post associate editor and a popular columnist. In her previous role as a national political correspondent for the newspaper, she received the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting. She joined the Post in 2010, coming from Time magazine. This is her first Idea Fest, but she started off with a bang Monday night by deftly moderating the wonderful conversation with Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. Wasn't that great? As I said at the outset, Dan mentioned, and we were talking downstairs about sort of pivoting a bit from the original title to more around Wisconsin and other swing states. There will be an opportunity at this session to put questions on index cards, and we'll be circulating those around the auditorium. We might run a couple of minutes late. We don't have a session immediately after this one. There will be a break. I should mention now that we're going to need to clear the auditorium between 4 and 6. We can't, so there's quite a break there, and that's union rules. So anyway, I've gotten that out of the way. We have a Q&A coming. I just would really like you to give a warm Madison and Idea Fest welcome to our panelists today. Thank you.
Well, hello again. The topic of this panel, I think, was designed to trigger my PTSD. In 2016, the weekend before Election Day, Dan and I wrote a story together about how there was this very narrow path opening up for Donald Trump. But I've got to tell you, I didn't quite believe it. So come election night, I'm supposed to be writing the lead story of the newspaper, and at 7:30, all I had ready was 80 inches of America elects its first woman president. At one point, my editors come in and say, "Karen, did you see what just happened in Florida?" And then a few minutes later, Karen, did you see what happened in North Carolina? And finally, they just showed up in my office and screamed at me, Pennsylvania! Anyway, so we had to rip that off, all up, and start all over. But I wanted to ask you guys, I mean, how is it this country has gotten to the point where basically 6, possibly 7 states matter, and the rest of us are just spectators in a presidential election?
Well, I'd point out the decline of swing states, especially in big states. You may remember a time when California was either a Republican state or a swing state. At least it was competitive and had an awful lot of electoral college votes. But we've also seen shuffling in other states. Iowa, that was relatively Democratic until not that long ago, is now solidly Republican. Colorado was very Republican in the 1990s and is now quite Democratic. So we've seen some shuffling both ways. But when we talk about which states have been very close in recent elections, we are down to just about the 7 that we've been talking about all year. You know the Great Lakes states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the greatest of all, Wisconsin, because we're our hometown crowd here, right? And now through the Sun Belt, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And beyond that, you really have to have a vivid imagination to think of another one that's really up for grabs this year. That's one of the smallest sets of states that are swing states in a long, long time.
You know, it is fascinating what has happened in this country over the last 30 or so years. There was some research done by some folks at the University of Texas, Karen's alma mater, that from 1952 to 1980, campaigns targeted, on average, 26 states, which is to say they put resources into those states, ran advertising in those states, tried to build organizations in those states, and probably had their candidates in and out of those states. Today, according to some estimates, there are only 18% of Americans who live in a state that's targeted. So it is a tiny fraction of the country that has now got the control over who's going to be the next president. I think one of the reasons that this has happened is what we have seen over the last decade and a half, which is this increased polarization, the rigidity of that polarization, and the decline of split-ticket voters. Again, when we started covering politics, there were a lot of people who split their tickets. And so you would have a state that would go Democratic in the presidential race, but they might have both a Republican and a Democratic senator, or they might have senators from the opposite party. Today, that is very, very unusual. It was, I think, in 2016 or 2018, for the first time ever, no state elected a senator from the party that was different from the way that state had voted in the presidential election. So we now have a situation in which we have a red team and we have a blue team, and people take their cues from that and decide how to vote on that basis. And as a result, many more states now are won by big margins. There are fewer states that are close, many more states that are not close. I mean, I always say the red states have gotten redder and the blue states have gotten bluer, and there's this handful of states now, the 6 or 7 that we're going to talk about today, that will decide the election. So, Charles, maybe since the title of this panel was "What's going to happen in Wisconsin," and you're the leading expert on the state of play in Wisconsin and kind of how it is moved and continues to move, can you give everybody a kind of a status report based on the most recent polling you have?
Sure.
And then project out to who's going to win.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be holding that until 3:59 today, or 4:59, 3:59. So don't leave. Don't leave like some people leave rallies. So the state of play here is still looking like a close election, but it has shifted over the course of the year, notably when President Biden stepped out of the race. early in the year, last November and January and very early spring, we had Biden ahead by a point or two. Then in the later spring and going into June before the debate, we had Trump up by about 2 in most of those polls. So it had shifted a little bit. Lying behind that is worth noting just how unpopular Joe Biden was. Even among Democrats, half said they wished he wasn't running for president, even though, we in primaries throughout the country voted for him. But that enthusiasm was definitely not there. So when he dropped out, Harris steps in, and first of all, Democratic enthusiasm jumps up by 20 percentage points just overnight, and has now jumped up again. Republican enthusiasm rose with the assassination attempt and the Republican convention. That went up 7 points here in the state, too, and has not declined. But Democrats who had been way behind Republican enthusiasm almost caught up in July and now are ahead of Republican enthusiasm. That may affect turnout. In our first poll with Harris, Trump led by 1, 50 to 49 with registered voters. Harris led by 1, 50 to 49 with likely voters. And when you had the third-party candidates in, Harris had a 2-point lead. So call that anywhere from 1 for Trump to 2 for Harris. Then in this latest poll, the number is 4 all around. Harris leads by 4 with registered and with likely, and she leads by 4 when you have third-party candidates in. So it's a very stable couple-of-point advantage. But don't count those chickens before they're hatched. You may remember how wrong I was in 2016. Speaking of embarrassing PTSD moments, where we had Clinton leading by almost 6 points, and of course, she didn't win the state. So be cautious about assuming these things. We're seeing a little bit of movement in other states around the country. We'll get to those in a moment, but that's sort of the lay of the land. It is still certainly close enough to take nothing for granted. At her speech last night, Vice President Harris was at some pains to point out, don't believe the polls, don't listen to the polls, go to work, don't get complacent. I think that's excellent advice, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Hopefully, things we say in the polls and show in the polls, especially about how people see the candidates and the issues, not just the horse race, can be informative. But my goodness, don't decide your vote based on what the polls are showing.
And Ben Wickler, the Democratic Party chairman, says that kind of the X factor in Wisconsin and I think maybe elsewhere is, Trump's ability to sort of make his own weather when it comes to turnout. He says their numbers have always been pretty close on how many Democrats were going to turn up, and in part because of same-day registration, it's harder to figure out. Is that your sense of it too? How many Republicans are going to show up?
Yeah, it goes both ways. So Democrats with a traditional strength with young voters often do benefit with our Election Day registration and organizing on campuses to get maybe an extra bit of support out of those new registrants, new college students, and so on. But what Donald Trump's secret sauce has been is mobilizing people who are dissatisfied with the political system, haven't voted regularly, if at all, in the past, but who are drawn to him. The problem for the Republican Party is a lot of those voters then drop out in the midterms in 2018 and 2022. But the Trump campaign has certainly been talking constantly in the last several months about mobilizing those so-called low propensity voters and getting them to the polls for Donald Trump one more time. And that's something absolutely important, especially when you look at the much redder north and west of the state, which is sparse in population, but altogether accounts for about 26% of registered voters in the state. And that area has been moving more and more Republican. Can Trump and the Republicans turn out even more voters there, just as Dane County keeps trying to turn out more and more Democratic votes?
Charles, you have nothing to feel embarrassed about a poll that was slightly off. In 2020, we did a poll of Wisconsin about 2 weeks in advance of the election, and we had Biden up 17 points. Nobody believed the poll, including those of us who had to write about the poll. We were faced with a choice of, do we write about this and basically say we don't believe it, or do we deep six it, which we thought was not the right decision. I'm not sure, looking back on it, about that, but you know, in 00 and in 04 and in 2016 and in 2020, this state was a 1-point state. Obama was the exception. He did much better than that in both of his elections. The question I had, and I asked this last night with Sam and Dan, the Democrats in the last couple of years, in part because of the work that Ben Wickler has done in building a kind of an all year round organization, but also just in the general nature of what's happening now in the state, do you see anything that suggests not a big turn, but a slight turn in the Democratic direction that might help to explain why Harris is doing a little better here than the other two Great Lakes states?
Yeah, frankly, it's a little bit of a puzzle, so I'll share the puzzle with you, and you can all come to your conclusions. One thing that's changed that is not in that direction is in 2012, our polling consistently showed about a 4-point Democratic margin on party identification, about 31% Democrat, about 27% Republican. But for the last 4 years, it's been about 30 or 31 Republican, 29 Democratic. And so that gain for the Republicans comes overwhelmingly from white non-college men who've gone from +4 Republican in 2012 to +24 today. And that accounts for almost all of that shift, but it also lines up with much of Scott Walker's base in 2010 and 12 and after, and then Donald Trump's base today. So the state has evolved, but it's just become even tighter. It hasn't moved it to an advantage one way or the other. But the flip side, and the sort of Democratic side, is that since 2016, Democrats have won almost all of the statewide races, a couple of 3 exceptions, but have done quite well there. And with exceptional turnout in the spring elections for the state Supreme Court, for example, and in the referendum this August, where the Democratic side, the no vote, prevailed soundly with 58% statewide. Some of that must be due to better organization for the party than it had, say, in 2008 or 10 or 12. But whether it can continue is another question. The shift in the Milwaukee suburbs, especially the WOW counties, amounts to close to 40,000 net votes for the Democrats that they weren't getting in 2012 but are getting now. And so that, we were decided by 21,000 votes, right? So 40,000 is nothing to sneeze at. But the north and west of the state, what used to be David Obey's district, what used to be Ron Kind's district, those have shifted just about as many votes in a Republican direction. So with all this change we've had, we nevertheless remain balanced, even though regional shifts are very real and some of those demographic shifts are very real.
And I must say, as I look at this election and how starkly different these candidates are, I have to keep wondering who the heck is still undecided.
Well, don't you go talk to those people? I'm sure we've got a bar somewhere in Wisconsin you can find them. The answer, in one sense, is just totally obvious. There are people who think of themselves as independents. They're not closer to either party. But what goes with that is, one, generally less interest in politics, because how do you sustain a deep interest in politics if you're not rooting for a side? But the other thing is this, that plays to Trump's strength, is the deep skepticism of both parties, dissatisfaction with government in general. And that leads these folks to not like either of the major party candidates, to be doubtful of government, and therefore to be reluctant to pick a side. those are exactly the folks that have amounted for the big share of the third-party vote that we've seen in the polls all year. That number is coming down as both parties are coalescing behind their nominee. The crossover vote's getting smaller and smaller. And these undecided voters, first of all, they're beginning to run out of time, and the third parties are becoming less viable, and so there's also some movement there.
We're doing some interesting polling at the Post this year. We call it the Deciders poll. And what we wanted to do was focus on the targeted states, the battleground states, and to try to get a sense of who actually was undecided. Now, we have a somewhat broad definition of that, which is to say people who literally say they are undecided, but also people who, at this point, really have kind of picked a side, but whose voting history is spotty, and therefore they're not necessarily reliable voters. And the first crack at this that we did earlier in the year goes to the points you're talking about. Much more disinterested in politics, don't like particularly either party. At that point, much more amenable to voting third party rather than for either Biden or Trump. Younger, more economically stressed, some of the things you would expect. We're going to go back in before the election and take another look at them to try to get a sense of it. Charles, one more thing on Wisconsin, and that is the role of Dane County. Times did a very good piece about this. Yes. You know, the numbers are fascinating, but Dane County is the key for Democrats, is it not?
Oh, it really is. And I commend that New York Times article this week on it, which talks about it in some depth. We've been the fastest growing county in the state for 20 years or more. We've added 18% to our population over the last decade. But usually what goes with a lot of population turnover and a young population, which relatively speaking we have, is somewhat lower voter turnout because new people move into a place. They take a while to settle before they start voting, and young people take a while to fall into the habit of voting. And boy, we are just the opposite of that. Our turnout rates go up and up and up. And even as they go up, the margin between the Democrat and the Republican goes up and up and up. So, you know, Dane's been a Democratic county for quite a long time. But we are voting, in some cases, nearly 60% more Democratic than Republican, 80 to 20. Sometimes a little less than that. But back in the old days, we were voting maybe 20 points more Democratic than Republican. There was actually one year where Tommy Thompson won Dane County for governor. That's been a while, but there it was, proof of existence, right? And so that combination of giant margins and giant turnout means that we are punching above Milwaukee's weight now. The city of Milwaukee and Dane County are close to equal in population size, but our greater turnout and our more lopsided margins makes us virtually as important, if not more, for Democratic statewide margins as Milwaukee is, despite the city being much bigger than Madison, for example. So all of this is driving Dane's influence in the state in statewide races. Doesn't help for congressional or legislative races where we're concentrated and we don't have a statewide impact there.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned a young population. One of the things that I have been fascinated with in the data this year is the size of the gender gap among young voters. Donald Trump is doing pretty well with young men and not young women. Is this something new?
No, it's certainly not new, but it is continuing to grow. We got into a rousing debate at dinner Monday night about whether it's historically high gender gap or just a big gender gap. So I won't take you through that fight, but dessert was really good. What we're seeing is, in this last poll, roughly a 20-point gap between men and women in their vote preference for president. But on the other hand, in the last Biden poll in June, it was about the same. It didn't really shift that much. But one of the things that underlies the gender gap is more and more women call themselves Democrats, think of themselves as Democrats, and that itself, because Democrats usually vote Democratic, right? So gender is behind the choice of party in a way that when we think of it as, oh, there's a woman candidate, that must really push the gender gap. Well, yes, it enhances that effect, but the gender gap would be there with 2 men candidates, it would be there with 2 women candidates, and so it's not driven just by Harris versus Trump. But it also touches issues in our data across every demographic you can look at: urban, rural, college, non-college. Women are more concerned over abortion. They take a more pro-choice position on abortion than men do, and that just permeates the findings. When Biden was in, though, women were rather skeptical of the economy with Biden and blamed him more for poor economic performance, and that, I think, did mitigate the gender gap a little bit earlier.
Karen earlier today was out in Richland Center at a Tammy Baldwin event, and campaigning with her was Governor Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania. And she and I had the same question: what in the world is he doing in Wisconsin, given Pennsylvania's importance in this election? Let's talk about Pennsylvania, which by every measure is the tipping point state. Karen, you want to talk about how that has happened and what the significance of that is?
Sure. Pennsylvania has been close for the last few cycles, but I think its elevated importance in part is because it has a very stable population. In fact, a population that is declining a bit. So it really is a mobilization state. I mean, James Carville famously said the political geography of Pennsylvania was Pittsburgh in the west, Philadelphia in the east, and Alabama in the middle. And so again, I mean, and I asked Shapiro, how's it looking? And he just said, tight, tight, tight. And of course, then that does raise the question, then why are you here? But he also says that, and one of the reasons that he was with Tammy Baldwin in Richland, I mean, and they are standing there in front of the local Democratic headquarters, and behind them across the street, you could see this gigantic Trump sign on the house across the street. I mean, this is a county that went twice for Obama, has gone twice for Trump, and in the middle of that voted for Baldwin. I mean, so he and she both argue that you've just got to show up everywhere.
Yeah. Earlier in the year, when Biden was still in the race, it seemed as though his only path to victory was to win the Great Lakes states. And of those, Pennsylvania was the most critical because it has 19 electoral votes. If Harris wins the Great Lakes states and loses the other 4 targeted states and wins a congressional district in Nebraska, she's literally at 270 electoral votes, which is the bare minimum you need to win.
I may never get a brokered convention, but if I could write a story someday that said it all comes down to Omaha.
Well, and now there's some effort underway in Nebraska to change the way they do count so that the whole state would go to the winner of the popular vote, in which case, if she won those 3 states and Trump won the other 4, it would be 269, and it would go to the House of Representatives, and Trump would be elected president. Charles, what are the other states that you're looking at most closely at this point in terms of where this race may be won?
Yeah. Well, what Dan just said is exactly right, that Pennsylvania with 19 electoral votes could be the decider here. But you do look at a few more routes to the presidency. I've been tracking the averages all year long. And the morning that Donald Trump was convicted in New York, he was leading in all 7 of these states. The morning that Joe Biden dropped out, Trump was leading in all 7 states. What has shifted now is that 3 are leaning towards Harris, 2 are true toss-ups, and 2 are slightly leaning towards Trump. But it means there are more opportunities. If you could, if the Democrat could pick off Georgia or the Democrat could pick up North Carolina, then that opens it a little bit. This last-minute change in Nebraska in not awarding that Omaha district could change things. So the bottom line is that you got to look at North Carolina, which is surprisingly close. We should talk a little bit about recent developments
Let's
there.
talk about North Carolina.
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll move on to another state.
So the news this week about their gubernatorial nominee, Mark Robinson.
Be careful.
I know, I'm not going to, just go look it up on the internet. But does this shift I mean, it does seem like just logically that this could really depress the Republican vote there. I think Trump is, today he's in Wilmington and he's not being seen on stage with the gubernatorial nominee.
Even though he had described Mark Robinson as Martin Luther King on steroids much earlier. I guess I'm cautious about the significance of this in terms of Trump's ability to win the state. And I say that only because almost nothing in the past year and a half, other than Biden getting out of the race, has changed the trajectory of voters' intentions. Maybe this will be the equivalent of what happened in Georgia in 2020 in the runoff elections for the Senate, when Trump's constant, talking about stolen elections and blaming everybody for things did depress Republican turnout in those runoffs, and it allowed the Democrats to win those. Maybe this is the same kind of thing. We'll have to see. We'll have to see how Trump handles it. The Democrats are, they're already trying to leverage it in their direction. The state is close enough that it might tip it, but I think we need to be cautious about almost any event short of the kind of seismic shock of the Biden decision to drop out, that it's going to really move votes. On the other hand, we know that when things are that close, everything counts. Everything is important. Even tiny changes can be significant. So I would say let's wait a couple of weeks, see how it plays out, see how the Republicans down there handle it, see how Trump handles it, and then we'll have a better sense.
Yeah. I think I've been skeptical that North Carolina would go Democratic. It's not voted for a Democrat in quite a while. I think Obama won it in 2008, but I don't think he won it in 2012. No. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it's one of those states that was it was the closest win for Trump in 2020 of all the states that he won. But the governor's race was leaning Democratic before this scandal with Robinson broke, and leading by a pretty substantial margin. And again, a little surprisingly, the polling there for president had been closer than you would have expected, whereas Nevada was exactly the opposite. Usually a Democratic state, Trump had some of his largest leads earlier in Nevada. So maybe these states can change and surprise us a little bit. The other thing going on under the hood there is the Democratic Party is in some ways looking a little bit like the Wisconsin Democratic Party, putting a lot of effort into the rural areas of the state. I'll have to say the young party chair, because she looks young to me, Anderson Clayton, in at least her rhetoric, is talking about a lot of the things that Ben Wickler talks about here in terms of organizing the state, going into places you don't usually win, and so on. Now, that's no guarantee that they can pull it off there, but it does look like it could be more competitive. Still, I too am skeptical that this thing with Robinson is the key to Trump losing the state. Yes, probably affects the governor's race.
Yeah. Let's talk about the two southwestern states and the role of the Latino vote in this election. As we know, earlier in the year, Biden was lagging significantly among Latino voters. Harris has begun to pull some of that back, but Talk about both those. Charles, you mentioned that Nevada normally the Democrats do pull it out. Sometimes it looks like it might be tight, but they pull it out. But they often did that with the Harry Reid machine, which has atrophied in the, since Harry Reid passed away. The role of the Latino vote in both of those states and how you think it might be moving. And Karen, add in from your own knowledge about those two states.
Yeah, so as a percentage of the vote, it's way big, certainly compared to Wisconsin. So that's a big Latino vote that matters. The concentration of voters generally in the Las Vegas area and actually the Phoenix area, where those two big cities make up a huge share of the state, really important. The unions in Nevada especially, big deal. And with the end of the reduction of the Harry Reid machine, we've seen Republicans win the governorship in Nevada, for example, while Democrats barely hung on to the Senate seat. This year, the Senate race looks like it's leaning a bit Democratic. And we saw campaigning there. Trump went and promised no tax on tips, so Kamala Harris went a couple of weeks later and promised no tax on tips. It may not be the most principled economic policy, but it is probably the smart political move if you're speaking to workers in Nevada. Arizona is a little different in the sense that it's become a much closer state recently. Again, one that's been pretty solidly Republican until recently, but has tilted a little bit in the Democratic direction. Still clearly a toss-up state. And there we've just gone this week through an effort to strike over 100,000 voters from the state ballot because they hadn't provided proof of citizenship. The state Supreme Court struck that down, so those voters will be showing up. But that wasn't for the federal election, that was for the state election.
But the other thing about the Latino vote is Trump is doing surprisingly well with Latinos and also with black men. I mean, people at the campaign have told me they think that 20% of the black vote may not be out of reach for him. And when you look at why Latinos are more open to Trump perhaps than we might have thought, I think you can go back and look at COVID and the lockdowns and who got hurt the worst. And it was people in jobs where you couldn't stay home, you had to show up for work. These were people, disproportionately young, therefore less afraid of what COVID was going to do to them, but they did see their livelihoods disappearing and are still trying to climb out of that. So when you hear people talk about, well, the economy seemed better under him, that's at least what I've heard from a lot of Latino voters.
That fits with our data. We do both. As you may not know, we do 6 national polls a year as well as the 6 or 7 Wisconsin polls. And what we've seen pretty consistently during the winter and spring this year was, again, this very low approval rating of Biden among Hispanic voters, both state and national. And when it came to the vote choice, something very close to an even split with a group that normally should be in the upper 50s to mid 60s Democratic. And I think that was a huge drag on the Biden campaign and an opening for Trump to take the disgruntlement with the economy, the disgruntlement with inflation, the perception that Biden had been inadequate to the task to really produce some potential movement in Trump's direction.
That is, if he had the discipline to drive a message. Because, he's really got a much more proficient campaign team around him than we have ever seen with Donald Trump. In 2016, until he got the nomination, it was basically him and Corey Lewandowski and Hope Hicks, living off the land. And then I think in 2020, the campaign was, to put it bluntly, sort of a bunch of grifters who basically ran them out of money. But this team has a very does have a strategy for how he wins. And the problem is the candidate can't seem to sort of stay on the message.
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly what we're seeing. It's almost as though there are two Trump campaigns. There's the campaign of the campaign, and that is the people who decide what ads to make and where to run those ads and where to spend the money and all of the elements that go into that. And then there's the candidate. And they, for really since Biden dropped out, they have not at all been on the same wavelength. And the campaign team obviously is kind of tearing their hair out about this. There's not much they can do. Donald Trump does what Donald Trump wants to do. And, you know, so far it has hurt him some. But, I mean, I was looking at the we do an average of polls in addition to doing our own polling. And from the time Harris became the candidate, when Biden dropped out, to about 2 or 3 weeks ago, she moved the numbers in every battleground state. Charles, check me on this, but
absolutely.
From 2 to 3 to 4 points. Over the last 2 weeks, there's been no movement of even more than a point in any one of those states. So things have settled a bit and solidified a bit. I mean, we're really kind of in trench warfare. So the question is, does all of, you know, Donald Trump's lies and, you know, his lack of discipline, how much does that really hurt him over these next half dozen weeks?
Yeah. Let's tie this together with the debate and what impact the debate might have had, the Harris-Trump debate, not the former one. And this movement in the polls, just for perspective, Joe Biden had the worst debate of my lifetime. And I've watched every damn debate, okay? It was just awful. And it only moved his vote down 4 percentage points. So no matter what you thought of the Harris-Trump debate, it wasn't the same as the Biden-Trump debate. And so expecting that to move things by very much, I think, is far-fetched when you look at how important that 4-point drop was. That was enough to push Biden out of the race. But still, I don't think we should expect a lot of movement. As Dan says, from the time she got in the race through the Democratic convention, Harris's support had gone up just about as a straight line, rising day after day after day. But around the Democratic convention, it more or less flattened out, and it's been fairly flat since. Just this week, we've started getting an appreciable number of post-debate polls. They maybe are a little bit better for her, at least at the national level, but it's a modest amount of movement. So we come back to how much could anything that happens, whether it's Robinson's problems in North Carolina or Trump's comments on the campaign trail, how much can that move things more? And I'm sorry to say, I think we're back to that game of inches where things could so easily tip one way or another. Last point, if you want a point of comparison, go watch the commercials during Jeopardy or during your evening news, because you will get a flood of presidential and Senate ads during that time. And the Trump ads are disciplined and on the point of the issues that his campaign staff are so desperate for him to do. And then go to C-SPAN and watch his latest rally and see how he strings things together. I watched him a lot over the spring, and while it took him an hour and a half to get to the point, there was a very coherent point there. The economy's bad, immigration is out of control, the immigrants are costing jobs, and the immigrants are causing crime. And while, yes, it was sprinkled in with sharks and Hannibal Lecter and all of that, that was a pretty coherent set of positions that he was pushing. Now, in the more recent events, I see a much less focused presentation by him. He is, I think, wandering into other topics and not driving that message, which at its core could have been a strong message.
Yeah, you know, and that was the moment in the debate when for the first few minutes, and it's always hard to be an opinion columnist writing about a debate, for the first few minutes, I thought he was kind of keeping up with her. And she was also whiffing some of her answers. I mean, she did not have an answer for, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? But it was when she gigged him on crowd sizes, he immediately went from debate stage Trump to rally Trump. And that was when, from there on out, it was lost.
There's one other thing that happened this week that I think we should talk about, and that is in Georgia, the election board ruled that the ballots should be hand counted, which is a recipe for a mess on election night and the day after the election. It raises the other point that we are in a period of election denialism. We're in a point in which election workers are under attack and under strain. Trump has given no indication that if he loses, he will accept the outcome of this election. What are we looking at after November 5th, in your estimation?
Oh, it's so scary. And the other thing is that, you know, because of things like what Georgia has done and just the way the election system works in places like Arizona, we're not going to have, if the race is close, we're not going to have the result for a while. If they do their job right and count the ballots carefully. And the longer it takes, the more the Trump people are going to insist there's something nefarious going on here. And, undermining the integrity of the election. All of that's pretty combustible.
Yeah. There's one scenario in which we could know by Wednesday morning, but that will require several states to all fall in the same direction. Pennsylvania goes for Trump. Trump does well throughout the Sun Belt. That could take most of the suspense away by Wednesday morning, even if there's still a couple of states that are very close. But at this point, I would expect we're a lot like we were in 2020 with 2, 3, 4 states that won't be decided before the weekend, possibly not even past the weekend, depending on how close they are if this administration of elections in Georgia, in which I should say almost all the county officials are opposed to these changes, but the elections board has moved with them. We'll still see how that plays out by election night. So late changes are one thing. Absentee ballots and processing them are another. As you know, here in Wisconsin, we have several places, including Milwaukee and Green Bay, where absentee ballots are counted at a central facility, and they can't be opened and processed until election night. The legislature and the governor were unable to reach any kind of agreement on changing that to allow early processing of them. So there's every reason to believe that Republicans will turn out more on Election Day. Democrats will vote more early ballots. And as a result, those early ballot or those absentee ballots, when they're counted, will come in the wee hours of the morning, maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, and likely will show a shift towards the Democrats, as we saw in 2020. That'll be true in some other states that allow absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day still get counted. But that means you got to wait until Thursday or Friday for those ballots to come in. So I do think if we could possibly set aside our partisan priors in all of this, we have adopted a set of election rules that sort of guarantee that in really close elections, it takes a while and it's controversial, and we seem unable to take administrative action, legislative action to improve on that. So bottom line is I expect it to be quite late being decided unless we see those dominoes all fall in the same direction. Trump wins in 2016 actually by, midnight or whatever it was when the final call was made, because Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania all fell in his direction. So the Electoral College wasn't that much in doubt in 16. But in 2020, Arizona and Georgia and us were all decided by less than 1 percentage point, and Georgia went through 3 recounts.
Yeah. You talk about the states that kind of move together or if they tip in one way or another. Just historical fact, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which Tad Devine, a Democratic strategist, looks at as one block vote. He calls it, I think he calls it MIPAWI, 44 electoral votes. Only once since 1980 have they not all voted in the same direction. And our friend Ron Brownstein, who's a numbers maven, says that in this century, the same party has also controlled the governorships in all three of those states simultaneously, except for one 4-year period when Democrats held Pennsylvania and Michigan, and Wisconsin had Republican governors. So, the Great Lakes states tend to move in the same direction, and we'll see whether that's the case. We've got some good questions from the audience, and since we're talking about the Electoral College, Karen, why isn't there more support for eliminating the Electoral College and going to the popular vote?
Because you would have to get all those states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution that would, their influence would decline as a result. And you know what, I personally, if I could take a time machine and go back to Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention, I mean, you would at least want, like, maybe every state to work the way Nebraska and Maine do, where you would do it by, seat congressional district by congressional district, allocating the electors. I mean, then you could get a little bit of what the Founding Fathers were trying to do besides protect slavery. And, at least there would be an incentive if you were a Republican candidate. You couldn't win all of California, but it would make sense for you to show up in parts of Orange County and Modesto, or, if you were a Democrat, to show up in Austin or to do something besides raise money. I mean, I just think the way the system is set, like I said, I don't think the Founding Fathers ever envisioned a country where, like I said, 7 states are deciding everything and everybody else is a bystander.
Well, and they never envisioned political parties in the way we have political parties today, and that's one of the other reasons why the Electoral College has become, problematic. I mean, it's possible again this year that we could have a popular vote winner and an Electoral College winner.
Third time this century,
yeah,
it would be.
third time this century. Charles,
I want to jump in just one second on this.
Sure.
I think I'm going to take the unpopular position here and say we're stuck with the Electoral College, but what are we going to do about it? The attraction of the popular vote, sure, but our Constitution is devilishly hard to amend anyway, and when it is amended in a way that takes away strength from these smaller states, that's just hard to see how that ever happens. So my optimistic, can you believe that? I'm going to give you an optimistic view, is that if you think your side is disadvantaged by the Electoral College, the way to address it is to go out there and win 2 of those states that you're not currently winning. Get 2 of those red states to start voting blue, or 2 of those blue states to start voting red. And that's a lot easier than changing the Constitution. All right, Pollyannish I will get, but thank you.
Charles, here's one. Does polling pick up the recent... Oh, I'm sorry. Beg your pardon. Does polling pick up the recent swell of young, newly registered voters, e.g. after Taylor Swift's announcement?
Yes. Yes and no. The yes part is that most pollsters these days, not all, but most, are sampling from the registered voter list. But that voter list is updated almost literally overnight. So pollsters that are sampling from it do get the latest registrants. They're not working off of a registered voter list that's 6 months old or something like that. But it is a bit of a problem here in Wisconsin because of Election Day registration. And we do have not a huge, but a significant number of voters that register on Election Day. We deal with it by asking our sample, if they're not registered, whether they will register for sure on Election Day. And we pick that up in part of our sample, but not all of our samples. So there is a bit of a problem with those true election morning registrants. But we're doing fine, quote unquote. We're doing pretty well on having that registration list updated throughout the year so that in each of our polls we've got, goodness, the most current data on registration.
I can say, having been at the Kamala Harris rally last night here in Madison, there was a lot of Taylor Swift music being played. Beyonce, not as much.
All right, here's another question. I'll try to answer this one. One thought persists in my mind. Why don't citizens simply cast their vote for the candidate with the highest moral character? It's a good question, and it really gets to the issue of what does motivate individual voters. Many of you may recall there was a book done some years ago called "What's the Matter with Kansas," and it was a book that the thesis of which was that people in Kansas are voting Republican, and particularly kind of working class voters, but they're voting against their economic interests and what's going on. And I remember having a conversation with Tom Vilsack, who the former governor of Iowa and now the Secretary of Agriculture, and he's very attuned to the rural vote and to people in Midwest. And he said, who are we as politicians or as political strategists to tell voters what is in their self-interest, that they're going to make that decision themselves? There are obviously going to be a lot of people in this election who will vote on the basis of moral character, but there will also be other people who look at the choice and look at their own lives and say there are other things beyond that that are going to motivate me to vote, and in many cases to vote for Donald Trump. It's one of the reasons that this country is as divided as it is. So, the beauty of our system is everybody gets to decide what's in their self-interest, and that's why this election is as complicated as it is. It's why I think it's as contentious as it is, and why, frankly, the whole country is under a great deal of stress at this point.
And if you had asked that question about moral character in 1992, you would have been a Republican.
Yeah.
I'd also say that one of the deep disappointments to me as a pollster is learning that not everybody agrees with me. And to this point, we do see things differently. And why? Sort of a mystery. How can all those people that disagree with me be so benighted? But it is the case that in a small d democracy, as a political scientist, I really believe in one person, one vote, counting all the votes, majority wins. We have to understand that we're not all, in fact, alike, and our preferences are our preferences. And if we want to campaign and try to influence elections, we have to understand what that other side is seeing and find ways to connect with them, at least at the margins. And maybe we succeed and maybe we don't, but I really want to put in a pitch for respecting the views of our fellow citizens, even if they are just not ours.
It's a good point, Charles. Thank you. Charles, this is one for you because it's a polling question. But Karen, actually, since you write about politics and polls, you should jump in too. Margin of error in polls indicates the result can go both ways, up and down. Why does the press and why do pollsters only imply the race could be closer as a result of margin of error when it could also be a much larger lead?
Sure. So, if you have a race that's, say, at 4 points and the margin of error is 4, then yeah, it could be dead tied. On the other hand, it could be an 8-point lead. So, absolutely right. But you don't know which, and at least theoretically, both of those are equally likely. So privileging one over the other is really challenging. The last thing is, in almost every interesting election, meaning all these 7 swing states, virtually every poll is going to have a result inside the margin of error. So as a former statistician, I believe in the margin of error. It's theoretically useful, but in terms of practical political insight, you can't use the margin of error to gain much insight into the polls.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
I defer to the expert.
All right. Karen, when undecided voters say they need more policy information from Harris, is that a proxy for something else? And this person also adds, when Hillary Clinton discussed policy, she was called a wonk.
Okay, is that a proxy basically for race and gender? I do think, given the unprecedented nature of her ascension as the nominee, I think it is reasonable for people to feel like, even though she's been there for 3.5 years as vice president, maybe they don't know a lot about her. I covered her 2019 campaign, which didn't even last into 2020. It was a complete disaster. So after Biden's debate, I thought, I need to get out and see her. So I traveled with her to New Orleans, where, among other things, I was shocked to discover there's no Wi-Fi on Air Force Two. Al Gore would be so upset. But I was really struck, having watched her so much in 2019, about how much more self-assured she was and how much better of a politician she was. And I wrote at the time, it's this woman, whether it's this year or 4 years from now, if she runs, she's going to be a lot harder to caricature and demonize than a lot of Republicans think she is. But there was also a real trajectory to her vice presidency, in that, Biden hands her, fix migration in the northern tier countries of Central America. I mean, a job that was essentially impossible to do. They really kept her in a lot of ways kind of backstage, and it wasn't until the Dobbs decision that the Biden White House began to realize what a political asset they had in Kamala Harris, because Joe Biden couldn't even bring himself to utter the word abortion in public. And that was when we saw her out there, I think, aggressively, for the first time, pushing an issue that really worked for the Democrats. So she has been, I think, almost unknown until fairly recently. So I don't think it's irrational for people. And she's positioning herself as an agent of change. And I think it's perfectly reasonable then to ask of a sitting vice president, if you are about turning the page, if you are about change, can you explain exactly, what you mean by that? So.
Charles, for you, another polling question. Who responds to pollsters' calls, and how do they differ from the rest of us who screen our calls?
Well,
I won't ask who threw that question up, but
yeah, raise your hand. Yeah. Well, I like the people that answer my calls, and I'm a little peeved with you. Look, for all pollsters today, if you're doing only a telephone poll, 99% of your dials will not even be picked up. When they're picked up, we get 35 to 40% that agree to do the interview, but it's the foot in the door problem of not picking up the call at all. As a result, we shifted our methodology in June of 2023. Before that, it had always been telephone with a live interviewer. Now we sample from the voter list and we send an email and a text message with a link to complete the survey online. It can only be answered once. It can only be answered by the person that it's sent to, so it can't be duplicated. And if we don't hear from you, then we call after a couple of days. As a result, now about 80% of our surveys are completed online. You can do it on your phone or on your tablet. And about 20% are still done by telephone. But with the telephone, we still have the same problem of getting to people to answer. The upshot of this change, and lots of the polling industry has shifted to this, is that our response rates are up a bit compared to where they were when it was only telephone. In the past, we were helped because Democrats and Republicans alike hated telemarketing calls and scam calls and all of that. But in recent years, that hatred may still be mostly bipartisan, but it's still much worse. And that's why we've moved to these methods to give people 3 ways to decide to respond. Respond to the email, respond to the text, respond to the phone. We're not yet desperate enough to come pound on your door, but if I can get your name and number, I'll come pound on your door next time.
We also at the Post have gone through a long effort to redo our methodology for the very reasons that Charles is talking about, and because the polls in 2016 were off, and the polls in 2020 were off also, and the American Association of Opinion Researchers did a big deep dive into what happened, and they said, yes, polls were off, and we can't quite explain why that happened. So everybody in the polling industry has gone to a different methodology, and we like to think it's going to be better, and we'll know more in November. Karen, the last question is for you, since we are at time and slightly over. Yesterday at the Idea Fest last night, Liz Cheney expressed a sense that there might be a swelling of Republicans who, when they get in the booth to vote, will vote their conscience against Trump. She said, do the panelists see any evidence of that? Do we?
I think the Republican base, at least, is pretty solid behind him. And, I think, too, even I was talking to a Democratic congresswoman from Florida, and I was saying, they've got that abortion issue on the ballot, and she said, all these pro-choice Republican women are going to vote pro-choice and still vote for Trump. So certainly there is a sort of never Trump shadow in the party. We saw that with Nikki Haley. We saw that with people voting for Nikki Haley even after she was out of the race. But then Nikki Haley endorsed Trump. So in the end, I think most people fall in line.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although the Harris campaign is working very hard to kind of create a permission structure for people like this, whether it's the Liz Cheney endorsement or the Dick Cheney endorsement or the long list of people who were in the Bush administration or people who work for Trump who are now, very much against Trump, and many of them are now supporting Harris. So there is some effort, but I tend to agree that seems to be a very small number of people still. So,
yeah, in January and before January, Trump's favorability ratings with Republicans had fallen to 70%, just 30% unfavorable to him, but that was the biggest it had been in years. But then through the primary season, as he won the primary, that fell down to about 20% of Republicans still unfavorable to him, and it's maybe a shade less than that now. But the percent of Republicans crossing over to vote for Harris or Biden before has been in the 5 or 6% range. And so that's the challenge of, you've got 20%, say, of the party that don't like Donald Trump, would have preferred an alternative. But it's such a problem for them to cross over to vote for a Democrat that 15% of them will still stay with Trump. Some will drop out and not vote, but only 5 or so % crossing over. I don't see much chance that changes.
I want to, on behalf of Karen and Charles, I want to thank you for these very good questions. We're not able to get to quite all of them, but they're really good questions, and it was a wonderful way to finish off the discussion. So thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you.